right?
Yeah, yeah. So by the way, we just started broadcasting on the YouTube, so it's probably going to cut in. It's probably going to cut in a little bit late. So just 1 second. Sorry, guys, we're getting the tech. Kind of takes a minute once we boot up to get the tech set up.
Yeah, we're live on YouTube now.
We're live on YouTube?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. So, yeah, good, cool. Okay, now I'm just going to put that link in the group. There seemed to have been some confusion with the setup there.
Yeah, yeah, I'm fixing my shares too. It's fine. I have some time.
Well, we just, no, it's fine. We just shared the ones that are, because it's fine, because we were just sharing the stuff from Zero Books Capital Comrades, so it doesn't make a difference. Edits. Yeah, so I'm just going to fix the link. There we go. Okay. Yeah. So, okay. So, yeah. Okay. So this I don't expect that, yeah, that happens. You know, you set up the tech. It's a little bit complicated, our actual setup, because we're using this new, highly sophisticated Facebook broadcasting kind of idea, which is cool actually, because like if you ever look at the views, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a high rate of engagement, but if you look at the views that a lot of these videos get, like 700, 800 in a group, so that's quite cool. Even if the live audience is fairly discreet, you know. Yeah, so we'll be going through these two essays, and I think they're very interesting because I think one thing you see when you look at these is that you know, you can already see kind of the character of Deng, you know, as a leader, right, at this point. So, you know, he's very, very focused. I think we said this before. He's very focused on pragmatic questions. Actually, the essay about, I was interested because the essay about Taihang deals very, very heavily with questions of price stability, like currency and price stability, which is interesting too, because like that was a focus, you know, during the period of Deng Xiaoping and during the period, because I guess like all, you know, really all leaders after Deng Xiaoping until Xi Jinping are considered to have been sort of emanated out of Deng Xiaoping's rule, right? So you have, I'm trying to remember all the names, right? You have Jiang Zemin, right? And you have, let's see. It's a bit tricky, right? Because even who the most powerful politician is, they don't necessarily maintain the same stable position, right? So it's a little bit hard, right? Like in Russia, you have the prime minister president thing, you know. Anyway, I'll go through it now. But the point is that prior to the ascent of Xi Jinping, the leaders in China were sort of considered to be offshoots of or carrying forth the program of Dengism, and actually even to this day, currency stability is considered very important. In China, I think the Chinese currency, if I'm not mistaken, is pegged to like 15 cents on the US dollar, and it has been for a long time, right? Which is basically to bolster manufacturing, right? Because like the economy has become like huge in Tao. There we go. Enderwigan's got that. Yeah. So the economy has grown a great deal, but China doesn't want to risk jeopardizing its manufacturing position, right? And this is one of the things Trump is actually frustrated about, right? He's like, you know, China, they got to raise the dollar, you know, it's totally rigged, you know, this kind of thing. So that's interesting. Right. And also interesting to note that some of the countries that were successful in East Asia economically in more of a market context, like Hong Kong, were even from an earlier point, they were very interested in price stability. So in Hong Kong, actually, I think they've pegged their currency. I don't remember all the details, but it's pegged to the US dollar in some way or another, right? To ensure that it's sort of optimal for investment. So it's interesting that theme surfaces so heavily. So should we hop into to just kind of get into this and take a look, or what?
Yeah.
Okay. So economic development in the Taihang area. So this is from 1943, right? So you know, the 8th Root Army, of course, he mentions here, which is one of the you know, one of the major armies, right? That was the army under Mao's supervision, I think. The 8th Root Army, though poorly equipped and without a single copper or bullet of assistance in 4 years, for the 8th Root Army, though poorly equipped and without a single copper or bullet of assistance in 4 years, to have overcome so many difficulties and to have done battle with such a formidable enemy at close range is nothing short of a miracle. What is the secret behind this miracle? As everybody knows, we have Mao Zedong's principles guiding our strategy and tactics. It is by following these principles that through innumerable battles we have established, defended and consolidated each and every anti-Japanese base area, and pinned down half of the Japanese invading troops in China, lightening the burden of frontal military operations in the Great Rear Area. So again, you see here that the Japanese in 1943 are already, are beginning to be routed in China, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And in the next paragraph, he moves on to talk a little bit about the sort of economic attack that's being waged by the Japanese, right? Mm-hmm. The enemy's economic attack, closely connected to his military, political, and secret agent attacks, is extremely cruel. In the areas under his occupation, the enemy has been rapaciously plundering manpower and material resources. So he's talking about the Japanese here. The people's financial burden is double or treble their total income. When they run out of grain and money, they have to hand over their furniture to pay for the burden. The plunder of manpower is even more horrifying. A great many able-bodied men have been press-ganged, and the amount of corvée can hardly be calculated. Corvée, by the way, is obligatory labor.
Yeah.
An enemy commander announced.
Capital.
Yeah. An enemy commander announced the length of blockade trenches in North China is 6 times that of the Great Wall, or 1/4 of the circumference of the Earth. All this has been built up with the blood and sweat of the people in enemy-occupied areas. As a result, there have been consecutive crop failures there over the past few years, and a serious famine this year. Taking advantage of this famine, the enemy has incited the people to seize grain from the base areas in an attempt to create deep animosity between Chinese and the anti-Japanese base areas, and those in areas under his occupation. With regards to the anti-Japanese base areas, the enemy has been pursuing a policy of blockade and plunder, i.e. blocking the supply of the materials we need, taking the materials he needs, like grain, incessantly nibbling the border areas, and flagrantly plundering and trampling on the base areas in each mopping up operation. Killing and press-ganging people, burning houses, destroying farm tools, seizing draft animals, burning grain, and ruining growing crops. The enemy has perpetuated all kinds of atrocities to, quote, destroy the lifeblood of the war of the resistance. The people are deeply distressed by the devastation caused by the enemy. Unless effective measures are taken, it would be inconceivable to persevere in the war behind enemy lines once people's vitality is exhausted and provisions for the soldiers and people cannot be guaranteed. In the Taihang area, we are guarding against such an eventuality, and we are paying particular attention to the economic front. So this establishes sort of the focus of the essay, right? And it's how to push back, right? Against these efforts that have been made by the Japanese to economically cripple China, and also to pit Chinese against Chinese through a sort of managed economic policy.
Mm-hmm.
So
he says that.
Oh, so continue, sir.
Yeah, he says that Mao. I'm just going to continue also. That Mao advocates for self-sufficiency and self-reliance, right, as a guide for our economic development, and we have been following this guide in our development work over the past 6 years. After meeting with countless complications and difficulties, we have found a way that has made it possible for us to meet the needs of the war effort, protect the people's interests, cripple the enemy's plundering scheme, and prepare for counteroffensives and post-war reconstruction. I think one of the historical details that might be worth considering in this case is that this war is being fought by 3 forces, right?
Yeah.
The communist forces, right? The nationalist forces, right? And the Japanese forces, right? Mm-hmm. And a big thing that made I think that made Deng what he became was how he turned the nationalist campaign around, right? Because in the end, I think he always had nationalist sentiment, right? But of course, right, not in the reactionary way, right? But rather in a way that showed in what he talks about, right? And I thought it was pretty interesting, and we might get into that later. The Wu Man'yao campaign, right, that he mentions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which campaign is this? Oh, the Wu Man'yao? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, the Wu Man'yao.
Okay.
Right.
And which campaign is this? Who are you talking about?
So a couple of paragraphs later, he starts talking about the different specific policies, right, that they're trying to follow, right, about grain supplies and the relation between industry and agriculture. And specifically, he says that to this end, the government has promulgated important decrees, providing, among other things, No taxes shall be levied on grain stores and bank savings. No taxes shall be levied on 1/2 of a hired laborer's income, and no taxes shall be levied on flocks of sheep, and taxes shall be imposed on the basis of a grain yield of an average year since the outbreak of the War of Resistance, the surplus amount belonging to the producers, right? So, and these decrees, these 4 or 5 decrees that they were promulgated, so Deng says, moreover, labor heroes and those who participate in the Wu Manyu campaign will be rewarded, right? And I looked up, and the Wu Manyu campaign, so I found this, right? From the University of California, right? To say, yeah, okay. Among the many peasant heroes promoted by the communists during the Yan'an years, perhaps none was more celebrated than Wu Manyu. Wu, a peasant refugee who once had to sell his 3 daughters to avoid starvation, moved to Yan'an from northern Shaanxi in the mid-1930s to eke out a living. On land allotted to him by the communists, and by means of hard work, determination, ingenious cultivating methods such as deep plowing, and sound management, Wu was able to increase his cultivated land manifold, raise sheep and cattle, and live a comfortable life. In April 1942, the Liberation Daily launched a Learning from Wu Manyu movement. It lasted a considerable time, filling the newspapers with articles about the enormous achievement of Wu and his devotion to the collective.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and it's also interesting in this passage that, and of course, by the way, when it said where he moved, yeah, that was communist territory because their base was in Yan'an, right? But it's also interesting here when Deng says this is the path that Dr. Sun Yat-sen pointed out to us, right? Because he was sort of the founder of the Chinese Republic, right? Which then fell, right? So it already situates, I mean, I think this is one difference you can see between Mao's work and Deng's work, which is already palpable at this point. Whereas Mao stresses more like, the kind of dynamic and transformative properties of communism as a social project. I think that, what you see in Deng's is that he sees communism as sort of a means to an end, right? It's like a means of social modernization, right? That seems to be sort of his primary concern. Now, he's very, very concerned with questions of equality, right? And questions of welfare in general. And that comes across strongly. But again, like, as I go through, and also reading for today, as you go through, what you find is that a lot of his criticisms are directed at, like, he quotes out of Lenin, right? Like, sort of the left infantile disorders. This is like a big part of where his criticisms go. So, and Mao would do that too, but then Mao would also inveigh very strongly against the right. So I think, perpetually, I think Deng's position throughout much of his career was like, well, we're the communists and we've won. So, we've marginalized the right to a high degree. So that means that we have to safeguard ourselves against the left, right? In order to pursue like a pragmatic path of social modernization. Now that can be disputed, right? Whether that's the best approach, right? But you understand sort of the way he saw it, right? Because there are exigencies which are imposed due to being part of like a world system, even if you disconnect or de-link, as Samir Amin would say, that are objective and necessary regardless of sort of your ideological stripes, right? So that's important, and I think that's what you kind of get out of this. We can keep going. So you see some of the measures here, right, that they're taking. So this is in the Taihang area. We arouse the people's enthusiasm for production work, criticize idleness, organize and redistribute the labor force, improve seed strains, supply the necessary drought animals and farm tools, mobilize children to collect manure, call upon women to participate in production work, mediate between landlords and tenants and between employers and employees, mobilize the people to plant trees. I don't know if you know this, like afforestation campaigns were like a big thing in the Chinese Communist Party. Build the irrigation ditches, dig wells, make water wheels, and so on. These are all very concrete jobs. In addition, the government has been granting low interest and interest-free loans every year, ranging from several million to 10 million won. The slogan, increase production, improve life, and prepare for counteroffenses, can be heard all over the Taihang Mountains. we've been victorious on the production front year after year. And about these slogans, I don't know if you guys know, but one thing that the Chinese communists did in this time was they actually had this sort of anthropological aspect, because they would send certain people to these towns and they would figure out like what their folk music was. Actually, one of the great Chinese films, Yellow Earth, deals with this from 1984, I think. Very low budget. It was like $100,000 US at the time. But they would send people to like small towns, and they would figure out like what the folk songs were, and then they would rewrite the lyrics to like praise communism. It's true. That's actually true. So
that's actually there's a lot of there's a lot of communist folk songs in Mexico, and they use the same tunes as common folk tunes. So I'm sure the same thing happened here.
Yeah. I remember being actually, and even in France they have the same thing. I remember being at a PCF meeting in France, and they had like a song that was like in a French folk thing, and it was like, Nous sommes le membre de la Ligue de Trotsky, and then there were like all these like, it was like all these words. They were like, je suis rouge comme ma voiture de sport, like I'm red like my sports car, dans la Ligue de Trotsky and stuff like that. So they had it's an old communist trick, as Andrew Wiggins says. Okay, so here he talks about the handicraft industry. No kerosene, cigarettes, soap, and luxuries are imported here. We make our own cigarettes and other items, and have enough and to spare. For example, we export a part of our products such as cloth, towels, other cotton textiles, and paper. We're short of salt and matches, which are not so difficult to procure. We are making steel for flint as a substitute for matches. By the way, that would have been important to Deng, because I don't know if you know this, he was like a chain smoker. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, actually, I've noticed. Yeah,
the teeth. Yeah. No, he was like, well, and also like, what was the quality of dental care, right, in his life? But
they're like brown,
particularly worse.
Well, his fingers too. Yeah. No, he was a chain smoker, and he also like he drank like every day. He would have like 3 or 4 beer, and just like after work, and like so he was also he was hardworking. He was quite chill as well. Have you ever heard of Chinese ciggies? I heard they're pretty rough. Yeah, I don't know about that. I think they probably smoke a lot of Western brands now, but they make public cigarettes, because tobacco is part of the public industry. So probably a mix.
Oh, by the way, Conrad.
Yeah.
There's one thing I found kind of interesting in this handicraft part at the beginning here, where he says, the handicraft industry still has a ways to go, but the results so far have greatly reduced the inflow of goods from enemy-occupied areas. And I find particularly that he notes this. Like, one thing that I've been getting throughout going through this essay is that Deng maybe isn't explicit about it, but he certainly has a sense of the whole going on in terms of the land, and of understanding the different areas as interconnected. Because the Japanese, when they came in, the Kuomintang, when the Kuomintang came in, there's extirpation of the land and the goods, and totally turning all of the resources of the land for their one use. And here, and we'll see later on, where Deng is not just going into the area and subjecting it to anything the army needs. He makes the army also do work, especially when we start talking about the free laborers later on. But that there's a bit of an organic whole going on here, which I'm just rambling, but that's my point. I just want to highlight that Deng is sensitive.
Yeah, well, I think there's definitely a holistic vision. I think that's correct. You look at here too, in Wuhan County alone, for example, loans have been used to organize more than 20,000 women in textile production. Their daily income can support 1.5 to 2 persons, which has impressively elevated the social status of women. Yeah. Loans have also been granted for water conservation projects. This year they amount to between 40,000 and 50,000 yuan. The workers are all drought victims. Every day each worker earns 1.5 kilograms of millet in wages, and he can save some of this for his family. And he writes, cooperatives have also sprung up everywhere. In enemy-occupied areas, drought victims have been left homeless, and a great many have died. In anti-Japanese democratic base areas, drought victims have suffered a little, but thanks to the government planned and organized relief efforts, they maintain full vitality to both fight the enemy and combat nature. Combat nature, I like that phrase. It's like, so you see this, I mean, well, I think one thing in terms of, like, if you're talking about Deng and sort of the totality, by the way, as with Kushik, I will, if you stick around, maybe at the end I can talk a little bit about my view and Zizek's ideas. That'll take that. I can't do that in like 10 seconds, so I'm gonna need like 5 minutes anyway. So, but we're talking about this now, so if you stick around, you can do that. If you look at, yeah, I mean, one thing that I think comes across very clearly is that, you know, Deng sees political legitimacy as being, and he always did, right? But he sees political legitimacy as being deeply intertwined with, you know, the question of the capacity to assure a decent living standard for all people, right? You know, so he says, like, there are times when we could acquire more military resources, for example, right? Acquire more grain by appropriating it, right? You know, get more resources, but we shouldn't do that because, you know, our lifeblood is sort of the will of the people, right? And if we lose that, then we're done, right? So I think that comes across strongly in this as well, is that he's like, well, we can beat the Japanese, we can beat the nationalists. And by the way, the treaty between the communists and the nationalists was dissolving in 43 because it looked like the Japanese were like in the throes of collapse. So those two factions started going at it again, right? So it existed in name only after 43. Yeah, you see this consistent focus on that. So the first policy he says here, so he talks about some of the failures early on. The early days of the War of Resistance witnessed excessive assignment of corvée duties and wasting of manpower, but those were soon corrected. Later, we found some formalistic and bureaucratic ways of doing things, such as too many mass meetings and cadres meetings and excessive sentry duties and drills of the People's Armed Forces, all of which hindered the peasants' farm work. So, you know, again, focusing on work. I don't know if you know this, but one thing is that Deng hated meetings. He was like, he really hated meetings. He's like, just do it. Like, I don't want to have like a meeting about it. Like, because his thing was like, if you want to do something, you should just do it and see if it works. And if it works, people support it. And if it doesn't, they won't. But you have a fucking meeting about it, it's like not always useful. I mean, he was a Democrat, but you know, as a procedural thing.
Yeah. He's pretty good with his criticism. He says that, for instance, he says our cadres know too little about production matters and often make decisions according to their wishful thinking. For instance, it wasn't until spring plowing time that they called upon children to collect manure and paid attention to the selection of seeds and other such work. Isn't that absurd? In another example, their leadership over development of the handicraft industry has remained empty calls in many cases, and they have made no efforts to settle the masses' practical problems. The cooperative movement is not satisfactory either. All these problems have to be solved in the days ahead, right? This thing just sent an email. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that these are all practical problems that really show up even today, right? Mexico is trying to go through this fourth transformation, right, quote unquote, and a lot of the talk has been explicitly about this, right? About how do we support specific sectors of the economy? How do we make sure that they grow, right, and develop? And something that I find pretty terrifying about American political discourse is that it's super far removed from production, right?
Well, there is no production in the United States. It's like a rentier economy. So how could it concern itself with production? I mean, it's like, you know, the thing is, like, it's a rentier economy, and the benefits, you know, they've like, there's, you know, compared to a production-based model in which you had like unions that were robust, right? The development of rentierism. I'm not saying that this is a priori, but the development of rentierism has went hand in hand in practice with an increase in disparity in wealth because of you know, means of evading taxation and the lowering of tax rates that have went hand in hand with the building up of this kind of economy, right? One of the weird things about American political discourse, I mean, it's interesting to ask yourself the question of what is a democracy, right? Because I have the distinct impression that the Chinese Communist Party is more sensitive to the immediate questions of the welfare of its citizenry. You know, I mean, America's quite exceptional. Like, America's quite exceptional. It's like, you know, I mean, America has like the worst wealth inequality of any developed nation, like probably worse than almost any developed nation. You know, no public Medicare, which is de rigueur in like every other first world country, right? Like, you know, and then to think like 70% of people, including most Republicans or plurality of Republicans, support public Medicare, right? and now you've got, Biden, who's a Democrat, who won't even support that, right? So the disconnect is quite absolute, right? I mean, I think the truth is that in China and the United States, okay, yeah, the United States is more democratic, but I think the truth is that it's not so different in the sense that in China you have a very robust local democracy, but you have a real disconnect with the upper echelons of the leadership, and I think the same is true in China, or even greater degree, right? But I think that the thing is the motivations of the upper echelons of the leadership, because just because you're democratically disconnected doesn't mean you're against most people, right? It creates that as a liability, but it doesn't mean that automatically, right?
Yeah.
So I think that even as they're disconnected to some degree from more vigorous input, I think that the upper echelons of the Chinese leadership are more sensitive to concerns regarding immediate welfare. Right.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of Ted Cruz right now. Right.
What are you thinking about other than just his general person? What are you thinking about specifically?
He's my neighbor senator, right?
Yeah.
Because Nuevo León and Texas are right next to each other, and we have our own Ted Cruz, right? He's called Samuel Garcia, but he's young. He's 6 years older than me, right? So he's super young. He's about our age, I guess.
Okay.
And Ted, that's a boomer, right? But they are the same political class, right? Of this person who is clearly there just to pull favors, right? Transparently, just a stooge for some corporate interest. And thankfully, Mexico doesn't have the terrible electrical infrastructure that the United States has, apparently, or that Texas has, apparently, because if we had to recur, they're both scumbags, of course. If we had to recur to Samuel Garcia for our electricity, we would be in the same position as Texas right now. But thankfully, and kind of a parallel with China, and one of the big fights that we're having politically in Mexico is that we're trying to boost our nationally owned industries, right? And now the big conversation is around the Comisión Federal de Electricidad, the Federal Commission of Electricity, right? The power company, pretty much.
Yeah.
And so what happened here in Mexico is that this polar vortex came in, shut power in several states in the United States and several states in Mexico. But from what my understanding is that in Texas, they're still having problems. There's still no water. There's still no power. There's still no gas. And in Mexico, the Federal Commission stepped in, right? And they bought gas from outside the country, right? From I think from Asia and from Latin America, if I'm not mistaken. And right. And we're using that for electricity. It's super expensive, but people aren't dying for profit.
Yeah. No, it's crazy. It's crazy, the level of dysfunction you get in some states that have adopted a more libertarian model of governance, right? Which is particularly characteristic of ex-Confederate states for complex historical reasons. But I'm glad to hear that Mexico is doing okay with that. Anyway, we should get back to the second point though here. In addition, he writes here, we've conducted 2 successive campaigns for better troops and simpler administration, with the result that agricultural tax paid in grain in 1943 is 16 to 70% less than in 1942. So you see, again, reduction of the tax burden, which I think is understandable under these circumstances, because people are so strained already, right? Realize when he's talking about the tax burden, all but the richest farmers would have been potentially struggling, right? Under the conditions of the war. So the unified progressive taxation adopted by the Provincial Assembly will come into force in the Taihang area this year. This serves the interests of the people of all strata and will have 80% of people paying taxes. So again, they're just cobbling together their centralized tax system, right? This is, this is the level of development we're talking about. They don't have a tax system to step into, right? Thirdly, our policy of taxation and trade is based on the principle of external control and internal flexibility. It is our goal to strike a balance between the flow of goods in and out of our area. Again, which I would argue, and I think this essay is interesting because it's you can understand a lot of what he later did with China in this way. But if you look at like, you know, in China, like trade surpluses being like a big thing, right, in terms of like exports, right? So, you know, he says here we're very concerned with this. You know, again, currency stability, trade exports, the active use of government to encourage production. These are all things that became staples of Deng's, you know, leadership. So we're concerned with the flow of goods. We've banned all kinds of luxuries and restricted the inflow of non-essentials, right? Again, to encourage a more favorable trade balance, right? At the same time, we've organized the outflow of non-essentials and surplus goods from the base areas, such as medicinal herbs and straw hats, in exchange for goods from the outside. And this is fucking hilarious because, like, of course, this is kind of what China did with the States, right? It's like, you know, export, you know, it's like we're creating essentials and we're importing non-essentials, right? Which is a good position to be in. With regard to tradesmen's speculative activities, it made use of publicly run shops and cooperatives to restrain them. These methods have served to considerably increase our capacity to fight the enemy, boost tax revenues, bring about a flourishing market, and meet the people's needs. Of course, our comrades made some mistakes in this regard. For example, they discontinued trade with other areas for a while. At first, they lacked adequate understanding of the role played by tradesmen, and they exercised rigid control over the cooperatives, right? So again, you know, him sort of chiding them for certain things like that. So he says here, and then this is the part where he talks about monetary policy. So this is the principle behind our policy is to eradicate the currency issued by the puppet regime and protect the legal currency, right? So to devalue and destroy the currency that had been issued by the Japanese and to propagate the currency that they were using, right? So we've issued Southern eBay banknotes as the local currency in our strategic zone. This has crippled the enemy's scheme of making use of the legal currency, restrained the market for the puppet currency, reinforced our position in the economic struggle with the enemy, and fully guaranteed economic development in the base areas. In order to fortify faith in our own currency, we've restricted its issue and granted big loans to individual people and production undertakings, thus gaining the people's warm support and strengthening the people's faith in the currency. So again, this is what I was saying about price stability, right? So rather than just giving everyone a bunch of currency, right, they're like, well, we have to make sure that if we're giving people currency, they're going to be productively applying it to make sure that it maintains its value, right? So they've been yeah, like to make sure that it maintains its value, right? So there's a concern, right, for the production side with that. When the enemy plunders grain, we encourage the people to upset the army's plan through an armed struggle and by any other means. So, you know, just giving support to. The above was a brief account of economic development in the Taihang area. What have we learned from this experience? First, everything that goes in our enemy's rear area is inseparable from the intense struggle against the enemy. All our achievements in economic development have been paid for in blood. Second, without the correct policies, there can be no economic development to speak of. These policies must be shaped in the light of the well-being of the people and the needs of the war of resistance. Third, any attempt at economic development will be fruitless without the voluntary and active participation of the people. Fourth, economic development can be guaranteed only when we assign a large number of capable cadres to the economic front and help them gain experience. The struggle in the days ahead will be even more ruthless and will take still a fairly long time before it results in our victory in the war. Comrade Mao Zedong has told us that fighting, production, and education are the three major responsibilities for us behind enemy lines. So again, that's kind of the rundown of that. So what do you guys think of that essay in general? What do you guys think?
Well, as I said a little bit earlier, I think it really makes me think about the differences in the political discourse right now, right? It seems we're talking about things that don't really affect people's well-being, right? When we talk about, you know, just, right, general politics, even worldwide, right?
Yeah.
And I think instead, maybe we should be having more conversations about this kind of things, right? About the economic development of our area, right? And having a more reasonable understanding of our environment through its economical politics.
Yeah, no, and that's what I find, like, that's what I get frustrated about with certain discourses, like in our group, is they remain like at an abstract level. And I think, you know, yeah, you're always gonna, you know, you're always going to render yourself unclean, right? As soon as you like go into like, start to discuss what's transpiring in the field of social reality, right? But I think it's really important. And you see like, what made, people like Deng Xiaoping, also people like Mao Zedong, what made them effective insofar as they were effective was not just, abstract convictions. It was also that they had, had built up experience in these areas, right? Decades and decades of experience, right? The likes of which I think is quite, owing to our time, but owing to our social positions, the likes of which would be quite unfathomable to us. Because you have to like fail too, right? Even now, like, we step in and we're reading this stuff by Deng and we're thinking like, oh, this is like a young guy, right? And it's like, well, he's already 38 years old, right? And he's been doing this for 20 years.
Yeah.
So this is not like, this is not amateur hour Deng, right? Like this is a guy who's already seen a lot, very well educated guy. A country with majority being not literate, right? This is a well educated guy, a guy who's seen a lot, a guy who's lived in Paris, right, when he was young, right? And and so I think it's important to remember that the works we're reading are also already the consequence of a long process of evolution, right? Deng became the leader of China when he was what? When he was about 73, right? So and then he sort of led till he was like 90 or something like that. Right, so it was already, probably the comparisons end there, but it was already a long life of dedicated revolutionary service.
Yeah,
right. And that's another thing that people forget too about Deng is like sometimes they're like, oh, he's just this capitalist roader who came in and like it's like, he'd already put in, like I don't know, like 45 years or something
of work. Right?
Yeah, work. Like
actual work, right? Not posturing, right? And writing from another country, like actual administration, right?
Yeah, 45 years. Like that's what I mean. It's like I think it's funny when people are like, "Oh, he's not a communist," and it's like, like where the fuck would someone? Like,
he was communism, like for a long while. Right.
Well, it's just like it seems strange to me that you would like decide to like fight the Japanese, fight the when he joined the Communist Party, it's not like they were in like an advantageous position vis-a-vis their enemies. I mean, it could well have been suicide, right?
Yeah.
So why would you do that if you didn't strongly believe in those convictions? Now you can disagree with some of the things he did, and I do, right? But that's not the point, right? The point is that I think it's already. It's already slanderous, I think, to call into question like the basic political convictions of someone like that.
Yeah,
you can question the political choices and how useful they were for the fulfillment of that ideal. And certainly there were especially isolated decisions which I don't think were helpful in that regard. But the basic axis of his political and ideological development, I think, is quite unquestionable in that way. But you do see reading these essays how in the time of like the Cultural Revolution, for example, how he might have been, potentially a target because, the imperatives are so aggressively pragmatic.
Yeah.
Right. Should we move? Let's move on to the next. Let's move on to the next essay.
Do you think?
Which is
do you have any thoughts, Tim? Before we move on.
Yeah, Tim. Yeah, do you have anything you want to say?
Yeah, I kind of gave what I took out of the essay the most in my earlier comment, but really the other thing that interests me here is that there is both a cultivation and expenditure going on in terms of economic activity that, especially when he starts talking about striking back against the enemy, though I may be confusing it with some of the parts in the second essay. But being able to take an advantage and being able to advance and fight the war while at the same time not devastating your own land. Just the idea. It's a good idea. I just want to praise it. That's about it.
Well, he actually says in a later essay, and I think one I might put this up to read next, but what he says is basically like every single time we engage in violent direct confrontation, not with the Japanese, but he says with the nationalists, every time we engage in violent direct confrontation with the nationalists, we turn people against us, and he's like, this is why time and time again we've seen that, actually, and even Sun Tzu says this, right? The best way to win a war is by not fighting, right? Right. He says it's like the best way is to undermine the political terrain in which they're required to operate, like the economic and the political terrain. And this was always Deng's sort of philosophy too. It was like the best way to fight is not to fight, right? It's to create like, the economic success, right? To create the political success where you don't need to fight, right? Deng never went to war. He did, right? Do like a border incursion into Vietnam, right? For like, which was, set up to go for like, you know, this was in this awful Chinese support of Cambodia, you know, for strategic reasons. But you know, that whole invasion of Vietnam was like just set up to last for like 10 days or something, basically just to make a statement about internal security and then to withdraw. Right. You know, so he spent much of his life, you know, in terms of, you know, his thing was like, we have to get the SEZs going. We have to get economic development going in the port areas to make them strong to you know, deter the Soviets from attacking those. Right. So it's like, you know, this was always the idea was how do we get ourselves in a position where people will be strong enough that people won't want to fight us. Right. You know.
Yeah, you can definitely see that in his dealings with the U.S. Like later when he's, I feel like you can easily see that with like buying up American debt and such, of trying to insulate and put China in a space where attacking it is a bad idea. Yeah, now like, look, America's like, how tied is America to China, even though it doesn't want to be, but there's nothing it can do.
Yeah, I'm wondering when the debt purchase, when they started buying the debt, because I think that might have been, what year did that begin?
Oh, it was after it was after one of the big crashes, but there's so many of them I can't keep.
Oh, do you mean the Asian financial crisis, maybe?
Yeah, it was the Asian financial crisis is when it started.
Yeah, and Deng, I don't think that would have been so much Deng, but you could have been like a Deng influence kind of policy.
Yeah, maybe.
He died in 97, so it probably would have been right as he was in the outdoor. But yeah, no, but that follows from that, right? And
even it's today, at least Dengist.
Yeah. Well, and even today you see, right? Like one of the big things in China is like they're trying to, you know, one thing they hope is that they'll be able to calm down the U.S. By using their connections in because there's a lot of American firms which are invested in China, and they know Biden's all bought and paid off by like Wall Street, so they're hoping to use Wall Street to try to tilt him in a less confrontational direction. Right? You saw that weird article in the China Daily about how they're trying to use Starbucks now?
No, I didn't.
They're trying to get Starbucks to help be an intermediary in U.S.-China relations.
Oh yeah. Like a country in itself, pretty much, right?
Yeah. So I thought that was quite hilarious.
Yeah.
So okay, yeah. Sorry. It's true that Deng was educated in the USSR for a while. So that was 1943. So now we turn up. So 1943 again, the time of 1943. That was like, you know, the relationship between the nationalists and the communists was dissolving. The Japanese were in the throes of defeat. Now we switch up to 1948. Obviously, the Japanese have been defeated, you know, and the Chinese communists and nationalists have resumed fighting. And this is just about a year or so before, maybe a little longer, but a year and some months before the Chinese communists will prevail in the mainland. Though they say the revolution is never done. Right, until they get Taiwan.
Enough.
Yes. But yeah, so this one is called The Situation Following Our Triumphant Advance to the Central Plains and Our Future Policies and Strategy. So basically, there was a Chinese general, I'm trying to remember his name, but actually there's an essay earlier in this book where Deng celebrates him. And he was someone who was, like, initially, I'm trying to remember his name, but wait, his name should be in the, so we're on page 75 now. I'm just gonna try to pull it up. Yeah, Lu Bocheng. That's right, Lu Bocheng. So Lu Bocheng, he had initially been sort of, you know, a bit déclassé because he hadn't pursued a strategy of asymmetrical warfare in the way that what Mao was advocating for, and the army had more successes. After Mao had kind of got more control of it. But what happened is that later in the war, right, in like 1948, Lu Bocheng led, and I think there was a few others involved, like Mao and Deng. They led an attack on the Dabei Mountains, right? And the Dabei Mountains was like at this point where it could like be a secure foothold, right, to get over the Yangtze River to attack the big cities in southern China. And it was this absolutely magnificent offense that was staged by Lu Bocheng, and you know, they managed to wipe out like 4 enemy soldiers for every one of theirs that was lost or something like that. And people were like, if we lose this, we're really done.
Mm-hmm.
Right? In many ways, it was like the turning point of the entire war, right? So Liu Baocheng, who had been derided, right, as sort of like a Soviet copyist and like a guy who didn't understand asymmetrical warfare, turned out to be like this great hero, right? And the one who, you know, maybe more than anyone in that particular moment, right, kind of like sealed the deal for China against the nationalists. So a nice little redemption arc for Liu Baocheng. I don't know. So please, no one look him up. You're gonna find out he killed himself in the Cultural Revolution later.
Oh.
But anyone get that? Where is Liu Baocheng? What happened to him? What happened to him? Liu Baocheng. So he retired. Actually, he served for a long time, and he retired in 1982. But apparently, he never earned the trust of Mao. But he earned his reputation through his own outstanding military skills and sublime personality. So yeah, actually, in the piece that Deng writes for him, what he basically says is that he says like this guy is like so exaggeratedly, you know, so committed to his work, you know, and so adept. He said the only problem I can think of the guy is like it's impossible to get him to do anything recreational, because Deng had this thing. Both Deng and Mao had like this kind of like life work play kind of thing, and they're like, oh, Liu Baocheng, he doesn't chill enough. I mean, Mao and Deng had a different work play. Mao liked to like go swimming, whereas like Deng liked to like drink beers and smoke cigarettes. But they both had like a, you know, you got to have something else, right?
Yeah.
So okay, so let's get into this.
Yeah.
So he talks a little bit. He's reflecting a little bit on the conflict. During those years, whether we were fighting in the Central Soviet area, the Hubei, Henan, Yinhua Soviet area, or the Western Yunnan Ibai Soviet area, we found ourselves encircled by the enemy on all sides. The enemy's policy was to keep the fighting centered around or in the Soviet areas, trying to exhaust the manpower, material supplies, and financial resources in our Soviet areas, and make it impossible for us to fight on, even if we were victorious in some military operations. During the campaign against the enemy's fifth encirclement and suppression, if we had moved from interior to exterior lines, dragging the enemy out of the Soviet areas in accordance with the principle formulated by Chairman Mao, the outcome would have been better. The Soviet areas would have been preserved, and the Red Army would not have been forced to begin the Long March. Unfortunately, the left opportunists didn't do it that way and fell into Chiang Kai-shek's trap. This time, Chiang Kai-shek wanted to resort to the same trick of restricting the fight to the liberated areas in an attempt to exhaust our manpower, material, and supplies and financial resources, and make it impossible for us to carry on and fight the move out of the liberated areas so that he could keep his rear area, with a population of 300 million, out of the war and obtain supplies from the area for his military operations. Although Chiang Kai-shek is shrewd in his calculations, we have our chairman Mao, who's even wiser and saw through them as early as when he began to formulate the concept of the principle for the war of self-defense. He pointed out to us that we should start by fighting on interior lines and then carry the war to exterior lines, that is, to the Kuomintang areas, after we'd weakened the enemy considerably. By doing so, we would ruin Chiang Kai-shek's vicious counter-revolutionary strategy. So again, this is Mao's basic strategy, was to basically like have a more diffuse offense, right? And to just like create like asymmetrical guerrilla trouble for the nationalists all over, rather than trying to fight them in like a frontal war. Because that's what the nationalists were trying to do, because they had like the big cities and they had the industry. So
and they also had support from the United States, right?
Oh yeah, all kinds of support. So they were like the nationalists were like, you know, if we enormous amounts of support from the US, the nationalists were like, if they want to go at us straight, then we take it.
Yeah.
Right. And so that was the mistake that people like Liu Baocheng were making, right? Was advocating for that kind of approach. Mao was the one who created the strategy, you know, or him and other people were the ones who created the strategy that would lead the Chinese Communist Party to this great renaissance, you know, after they'd already, you know, been pushed to the cusp of destruction. Right. Let's see. Okay, yeah, I thought it was a new comment. Okay. So from July 46 to June 47, we annihilated a total of 1.2 million enemy troops on all the battlefronts in the country. So he runs through some of the stories here. And then he runs through some of the past conflicts they've had, but then he gets to the question of the Dabi Mountains. Control over the Dabi Mountains is decisive for the general situation in the Central Plains. Strategically, the Dabi Mountains make an excellent base from which to advance. Being close to the Yangtze River and leading directly to Nanjing and Shanghai in the east and Hankou in the southwest, they provide an important springboard for us to cross the Yangtze River, constituting a constant threat to the enemy. Therefore, both the enemy and ourselves will fight for the Dabi Mountains, a matter involving a bitter struggle. We've already established 2 military areas in the Dabi Mountains, with a population of 12 million, completed extensive deployment for guerrilla operations, dispersed remaining troops to every corner of the Dabi Mountains, and built up armed political power at county and district levels. We've gained a firm foothold here, and the enemy will by no means be able to drive us out. So you see that the basic thrust within the Dabi Mountains had already been accomplished. But this is a big deal, right? I told you this is probably the moment when they're kind of sealing it, right? Like right here. This is the... and then he lays down the line, right, about because the Yangtze River, that's when you symbolically get into, the urbanized parts of China, right? And now he kind of lays down the line for everyone. Many of our troops from the north fear to cross the Yangtze River because they are not accustomed to life in the south. However, to achieve nationwide victory, they have to cross the Yangtze. Since the enemy still rules an area inhabited by several 100 million people, we have to cross the Yangtze and carry the war to the heartland of the enemy, if we want to achieve nationwide victory. Anyone who is afraid to cross the Yangtze is a coward, and anyone who yields to difficulties is not a staunch revolutionary. So a real, we got to get over this river,
Yeah.
The comrades surely want to know how long it will be before we can attain victory. Comrade Ren Bishi stated in this report that if we don't make mistakes, we shall certainly win in 3 to 5 years. So again, it was like 1, right? 1 and since there are 450 million people in China and only 2 billion people in the world, our victory will mean the victory of 1/4 of the world's population. And by the way, China is actually today like 1/7 of the world's population? Yeah. Like 1/6, 1/7. So it's shrunk, right, in relative terms, right? And that's a consequence of its development, right? Like, because there are parts of Africa where people have 5 kids still. I mean, not in China. Also the one-child policy, but I think mostly just the development, right, was the main driver. So, because, when people have money, they always have less kids, right? And now he talks a little bit about feudalism. Feudalism is the backbone of imperialism. If we do not oppose feudalism and carry out land reform, we shall be unable to support a protracted war, and the revolution will not succeed. Therefore, opposing feudalism is a fundamental task of the Chinese Revolution. So, and I think this is funny because there's another word actually in some of the upcoming essays that Deng will use, and the word is agricultural socialism. He uses derisively. So you see, I think it's not clearly articulated here, but I think part of his critique of Maoism was connecting feudalism with what he calls agricultural socialism. This idea that it would be possible to kind of bypass a more conventional process of urbanization and industrial modernization. So you see, it's interesting here because he says feudalism, then later he says agricultural socialism, but it's only I think when Mao was dead that he would really be comfortable drawing the line between those terms, like in his interview with Oriana Fallaci, right, 1980 or something. So most of the comrades who have resisted land reform, embezzled the fruits of victory, or been weighed down with, quote, mountain stronghold mentality, have remedied their mistakes through party consolidation. If we fail to make industry and commerce a success, we cannot develop the economy in the liberated areas, and the people's existence will be jeopardized. In that case, even if the Kuomintang didn't drive us away, we would have to leave and the revolution would fail. Hence the importance of the policy concerning industry and commerce. Private industry and commerce are an integral part of the new democratic economy, and we should help develop them. Then he goes on to talk a little bit about how arbitrary executions are not helpful, right? Says we should stop killing people randomly. In Yuxi County, an official who came from a landlord's family killed many people in a small town, causing the breakdown of work in several neighboring villages. 8 or 9 of the 10 victims, labeled lackeys, were poor people. Execution will solve no problems. I love how he references that he comes from a landlord's family too. Obviously, if he did something good, you wouldn't say that. But if you do something shitty, they're like, yeah, he's from a fucking landlord's family.
Of course. Yeah.
He criticizes some people for not taking part in land reform, and his views on land reform are actually quite complex. And I think you'll see that with some of the stuff many comrades have no faith in Chairman Mao's thesis that U.S. imperialism is a paper tiger, believing that the U.S. troops must be very formidable and that we are bound to be defeated. A revolutionary should not think that way. In particular, being Communist Party members whose revolutionary program or task is to fight against imperialism and feudalism, why should we fear imperialism? It is not so easy for the United States to send troops to China. Even if it did send troops here, I should like to ask, would you continue to participate in the revolution? Would you still adhere to the anti-imperialist program? Are you still qualified for membership of the proletarian vanguard? Communist Party members of lofty character should answer, fight imperialists to the very end. We should have such courage. So this is kind of Mao's like, like hyper, like when he's like, yeah, if America nuked us, like, it's okay. Like, it's like, he's like, yeah, if the States invades us, that's life. That's life. What are you going to do? What are you going to do, boys? I mean, Vietnam won, so.
Right. Yeah. China has better odds.
Yeah. The poor, I mean, I don't think the States could all they could do is a bit like Vietnam. All they could have done was like significantly stalled China's modernization and development. Like, are you going to beat China?
And they didn't. So
China? Yeah, and they didn't. Yeah. Probably because, and I think it was also because they just knew it was too much too big to, too much to bite off. The Soviets might have got involved. It's one thing to do like Korea or something, right? It's quite another thing to try to do China. That's a bit much, The poor peasants and farm laborers who make up 70% of China's population, plus the middle peasants who account for 20%, who together constitute the mainstay. In doing anything, we should always think in terms of that 90% of our population and see if we represent their interests and have their support. In the preceding period of land reform, usually no consideration was given to the middle peasants who make up 20% of the population. In fact, among the poor peasants and farm laborers who account for 70% of the population, it was only the poor peasant leagues that controlled everything. The so-called line of solely relying on poor peasants and farm laborers is erroneous. And then he talks a little bit about he talks about this in the Dabi Mountains. Such a situation occurred in the Dabi Mountains. There, small landlords and rich peasants were driven to revolt and took up spears to fight us, and the masses were harmed too. Recently, after we rectified the situation, the bandits and diehards laid down their arms. The poor people said it would have been better if we'd done this earlier. In short, we should not antagonize too many people. We should try to get as many landlords as possible to take a neutral stand and pacify as many as we can. We need to have a well-defined policy and suitable methods for handling our finances. The excessive issue of paper money is no solution. So again, criticizing, this is what I was saying about monetary policy, criticizing people for pursuing policies that have led to inflation.
Right.
And that's everything I had. That's everything I had singled out from that essay. I don't know if you guys want to add anything, or if there's any observations you guys had about that, or.
Well, I just think that there's a reason why Deng has this fame of pragmatism, right? He's never advocating for acting along ideological lines, right? Because it's, if you actually follow the ideological logic, you come to his conclusions, right? There's no point in just in outright separating, right? Contradicting, right? Landlords, just outright, right? Because they are a product of their circumstances, right?
Well, I think there is obviously, like, and by the way, he did support land reform, but I think one thing, I think Deng was very influenced by Mao's like on contradiction as well, right? So he's always looking for like the principal contradiction, right? And he's the principal contradiction right now is beating the nationalists, right? It's not like antagonizing, different social classes. He criticizes people for not carrying out land reform there. He says we think in terms of the 90%. He doesn't say we represent the landlords. He just said let's not needlessly antagonize those people, right? So it's a thinking of the principal contradiction. And later actually in another essay I'm going to suggest, what he says is that he criticizes, again, he uses Mao's thinking of the principal contradiction to oppose sort of left adventurism. So I think, it's interesting because I said that there's a contradiction in Mao's work between the theory of the way he characterizes the principal contradiction. I think some of the things he did, which were more voluntaristic in character. I see Deng as very, very committed to the thinking of the principal contradiction.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm not saying Mao's thought's very interesting. I'm not saying Deng's a better politician. I'm not saying he's a better thinker. Right. But I think if I could try to distill like a couple aspects of Deng's thought, which I think are important. I think one is always the principal contradiction, right? Keep your eye on the present, right? What are we doing now, right? Number two, I think is the idea that, means of production, right? Because you can't voluntaristically shift the relations of production until the means of production have reached a point in which, that's possible. Now, Mao had a slightly different view of it, right? Like if you look at his commentaries on Stalin, Mao says Mao kind of wants to, in a way that never really achieves it never becomes totally philosophically cogent, but is interesting and important nonetheless. Mao wants to really actively incorporate the question of political will, into these questions, right? So I think Deng is a bit more of like an old school. He's definitely influenced by On Contradiction, but I think he's a bit more of like an old school Marxist in that way.
Yeah.
He's got a bit more of like a Second International, a bit more of a developmental kind of view. And people trash the Second International. Look, obviously they made big mistakes, shouldn't have supported World War I. But voluntarism, and not the Second International, the German Social Democratic Party, but voluntarism and means of production, relations of production is always a complex discussion. Like economic development, phasical economic development versus political voluntarism is always a complex discussion. Right. And I think all you can hope to do is produce a solution that's adequate for your situation. Right. Rather than some absolute formula, like. Any thoughts?
Tim?
Oh, sorry. Continue, Ernesto. You're saying.
You said, "What do you think, Tim?"
Oh, thank you. The two things that we passed over that we didn't, I don't think we spoke too much about, was the note here on the left and right tendencies, which I found a little interesting.
Okay,
so the right tendency, I'll just quote: "The right tendency is manifested in that some comrades are not taking an active part in land reform. They take the Central Committee's emphasis on policies and tactics as ground for their inaction, saying that reform can wait because they have to study the tactics first." And on the other side, we have the left. The left tendency is manifested in the course of differentiating classes in land reform, where rich peasants are treated the same way as landlords, and the interests of middle peasants are infringed upon, and middle peasants are rejected. So it's kind of funny. They're almost like the two opposite sides of each other here. So in the right, we see a lack of action, and in the left, we see too much action. But I think the right way to understand the left here is that it's getting ahead of itself. You're talking here about the principal contradiction. It's when you're still dealing with feudalism, it's already trying to jump into a new category structure, which isn't actually quite present here. It's trying to take, like your kulak category, or you start taking like petit bourgeois or something like that, and somehow bringing it into feudalism in a rather messy way. And then here with the right tendency, I'm not quite sure, just because I'm limited here in my knowledge, but the fact that the lack of action here, I think, emphasizes Deng's, especially we saw this in the previous essay, of you actually have to try something to find out, instead of getting caught up in this anticipation and worrying. And you could have good faith or bad faith in terms of interpreting the right tendency people here, and there's probably a plethora here, but just that the central problem is that they don't actually want to try and mess up in the land reform, but they want to try to perfect it somehow, or to investigate it without actually investigating it.
Yeah, well, and keep in mind, like the classic Stalinist theory of the right deviation and the left deviation is that they're the same thing. Which is a great sort of classical Stalinist theory. But it's a theory that, like, it's this sort of weird like vertigo of conspiracy, but it's that, it was applied like against Trotskyists, right? And it was this idea that, like, if Trotskyists are trying to push the Soviet Union toward the pursuit of objectives that are going to lead to its internal dissolution, like waging war in Western Europe, for example, then it just plays into the hand of the right. Right, so it's actually weakening. So this is the and then you can kind of go from that to being like, oh well, he's secretly like a bourgeois agent, right? Like, of course, like it's a really weird like kind of disconnect between these things.
I mean, Trotsky did hang out with some pretty bourgeois characters in Mexico, but let's not get into that.
No. I have great respect. I have great respect for Trotsky as a historical personality. I mean,
yeah, of course.
I always say like Stalin and Trotsky were both right in terms of, because that like to say that Stalin's policy was successful in some ways is also to say that it paid the cost of a certain kind of interior degeneration, which Trotsky was quite acute in diagnosing, right? So I think the truth is somewhere in between there. It would be, I think it would be still, it'd be ridiculous to sit here and say like, well, Stalin was just great. I mean, Stalin did some great things, right? But was Stalin just great? That's another question. So this left deviation, right deviation stuff is interesting. And I note that, so if you look at what Deng's basic policy was, right? Deng's basic policy was like, we need land reform to build political support. Absolutely. Need land reform. We got to break feudalism. And he's very clear on that, right? But like he's like, at the same time though, we should try to break feudalism while not generating any, and I stress here, unnecessary acrimony, right? Any unnecessary difficulty, right? If people can be appeased and if we can achieve our objectives, right? Because we don't want to create like civil conflicts in all the regions we're administering over while we're simultaneously, fighting against the nationalists, right? Yeah. So the Chinese Communist Party would later, once they'd secured the country, and consolidated its sovereignty, they'd later be able to pursue more ambitious goals. But remember, everything you're reading here is being written in a wartime context. Just keep that in mind, right? I don't think this is suggestive of like the sweep of ambition of anyone, right? It's their examination of a wartime situation, right? So that any comments? Any other thoughts?
I'm good. Tim?
No. That was we went through all the points that I wanted to touch on.
Okay. Someone asked me quickly about my view of Zizek, so I'm just gonna put that out there really quickly, not to bore you guys.
No, go ahead.
So I'm just gonna say that I think Zizek's like a great philosopher. Really, and really good communicator too. Like really funny. It's like stand-up comedy. It's really funny. He's got these like great anecdotes. He's a great writer, even if he's not like even if his self-plagiarism and kind of incapacity to proceed from kind of point A to point B could be deigned not great writing based on some orthodox convention of how you should write philosophy. But I do think he's a great writer because when I read him, I'm always entertained.
It's engaging.
Yeah, it's engaging, which is like, I think that's the number one rule of writing. That's what, that was like they asked like Margaret Atwood, they're like, what do you think good prose is? And she's like, if I'm interested, it's good.
Yeah.
And it's like, we can talk about everything else, but if you can't keep someone fucking engaged, then that's already a problem, right? Mm-hmm. Robert Brandom or something, Jesus Christ. But what I want to say though about Zizek, so that's kind of what I'd say as regards Zizek. So Zizek's basic philosophical idea is to his idea is like, I'm a dialectical materialist, but I'm reading it through Lacanian ontology, right? And Lacanian ontology is the idea that like, if you think of like desire, I'm probably going to vulgarize psychoanalytic categories a little bit because I'm not an expert.
For it. Yeah.
But if you think of like, desire and the kind of gap that it's trying to fill, right? It's the idea that this isn't, well, I mean, even Lacan is kind of ambiguous about this, right? But the way it's interpreted by Zizek is that, this is a gap that's not just inherent to the constitution of the subject, right? But that also exists in reality, right? So in other words, like reality is always constituted by a gap that kind of defies, right? Its completeness, right? Its total coherency, right? So it's a kind of ontological theory of incompleteness. Does that make sense? Yeah. Mm. So he reads both Kant and Hegel this way. So the way he reads Kant and Hegel is he reads Kant as like, well, for Kant, like we have this kind of noumenal domain, which is never accessible, which is like a negativity. But then that Hegel sort of totalizes that. So Hegel's point would be that this noumenal aspect, this thing in itself that is there and yet cannot be reached, is actually a feature of ontological reality, right? So is it in the subject? Yes, right? At the same time, it's also part of reality as we know it. So it's not restricted to that. and that kind of makes it, in a way, unavoidable, right? Because it's always there. Okay, so that's the basic rundown of how I understand Zizek. Again, I might have vulgarized a little bit, but this is my basic understanding of it. So it's like, if we're talking about Zizek, it's like, where do I see a problem with Zizek? Here's the problem I see in Zizek. The problem I see with Zizek is that if you like, the question is, because he wants to say, oh, this is like it's dialectical materialism. It's materialism, right?
Right.
But if your materialism is just based on the supposition that there's like an incompleteness in reality, how productive is that in terms of engaging with natural reality or social reality?
Allegedly, it's infinitely productive.
He alleges, yes.
I mean, the whole point of infinite negativity, right?
Yeah. No, I get that. I guess but if you actually look at the way that this gets taken up, so if you look at, I don't know, so Zizek will often, the way he uses it often, I find it a little bit unsatisfying. He'll look at the observer effect in quantum theory, and he'll be like, yes, this is just the proof that, subjectivity is part of the ontological, it's a gap in the ontological structure of reality, and nothing can be totalized scientifically. And it's like, okay, but is that because you're not telling me something new, you're just telling me what I don't know. You're using things we already know to create proofs of what we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You know what I mean? So it's kind of based on this kind of weird isometry between the subject as negative and reality as negative.
Yeah.
But I just don't see how that graduates from being an interesting philosophical observation to being something that is really usable and practical. In terms
I feel it's a great answer to ego psychology in general, right? To Jung, for example, and archetypical thinking and gender identity, and all of those things. They all fall, I guess, to this kind of dialectics, right?
Yeah, the risk though, the risk of it though, Ernesto, is that the risk would be that it because he'll be like, oh, I support trans rights, but I want to clarify that I think that the domain, because sexuality is very paradigmatic, right, for psychoanalysis in terms of these tensions coming to the fore. He's like, I wanna clarify that that I think that regardless, the domain of sexuality will always be fraught and vexed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess it's a bit sometimes he just breezes over these things. I was looking at his most recent book, and he's like, yeah, gender social constructionists want to say that the binary of male and female is a new invention, but actually hasn't always been there. And he just throws this off in a sentence, and it's kind of well, I guess I just I feel like some, again, if you look at Adrian Johnston, right, how he uses Zizek, he'll take Stephen Jay Gould, his theory of X adaptation, an evolution, and he'll be like, yeah, Jay Gould has proven that there's gaps or contingencies in evolution, so this proves ontological negativity. And it's then I read a later paper by someone named Benjamin Losatho, and he was like, oh, but if we actually look at bacteria and the way it affects evolution, a lot of the things that Stephen Jay Gould says are contingent may not actually be contingent. So is this what you're doing, is just going around and finding areas that we don't know things about? But that's proof of ontological negativity. It's well, I don't know. Is that a useful way of viewing the world? I mean, I kind of like Spinoza, it's we, it's we would have no free will if we fully understood the universe, because then we would know everything's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's just an absence of knowledge. It's not something that's a priori.
I mean, it helps in, for example, right, following the things we're reading, when you want people to try to imagine a world where where their role in communism is possible, they have to break down everything, right, of how they see the world. When I started reading Marxism and so on, it was definitely a deviation from how I used to think, right, and how I used to imagine reality, and how I used to think of myself in the world. And now, with all of the things I've learned and I've read, I see different, to borrow the Deleuzian term, the different paths of flight.
Lines of flight, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it takes time. Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Timothy? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've been like casually following Zizek for a couple of years now, but the thing that I'm curious, there's two things. One is that I think Zizek is in a slightly awkward spot of his materialism can accidentally can accidentally become a kind of absurdism, which is what I don't think he wants to do that. Especially in the recent one that he did, the recent interview he had with Doug, it was like he starts talking about the mediator, meteor, not mediator, not meaning anything. Where he's trying to do like Job or the Book of Job in philosophical terms. I'm not sure how that's going to work out. But the other thing is that in terms of the infinite negativity, is that I don't think Zizek has quite formulated a theory of history that does something with it. I don't think he's theorized the positive development that comes out of the infinitely negative. Because like you were talking earlier about how I forget the theorist that you said, there's like, oh, there's an ontological gap here. Here's a proof of what we don't know. But if you grant that and then you come up with something later, because of the infinite negativity, there's labor that can go on and there can be something new and positive that comes because of the negative. And I think that, but I'm not sure if he's trying to say here's this permanent spot of negativity, or there is negativity and it of course is on the move.
Yeah, I mean that's why like he's formulated it as a theory of dialectical materialism. As a theory of historical materialism, I don't think it's acquired such a systematic articulation. But I think that probably has to do a lot with the priorities of because he's like, if you have to go and look at people like I'm trying to remember the names, but like there's a whole like school of like well-known Lacanians, and you can date this back to like Lacan's Italian note, who've been like building this kind of ontological edifice, which and all Zizek really does is like, he does a lot of things, but in this way, all he does is kind of rebrands Lacanian ontology as dialectical materialism, right? But because of that, because their priorities have been more in ontological questions, it's a bit harder to translate to a theory of historical materialism. Right, because then you'd have to kind of like do the work of like translating that, into. I'm sure it's possible. It's just not something. And he has used a lot of historical anecdotes, but I don't think it's something that I could be mistaken. I don't think it's something he's done so systematically. So that would be my brief critique of Zizek. And I think Matt McManus and I right now are actually working on an article on Jacobin, assessing Zizek, and trying to push back against some of the criticisms that have been leveled at him by our, bourgeois foreign affairs crew and people like that, right?
The organic intellectuals.
Yes, the organic intellectuals. Yeah, and there's like Matt Taibbi, right? He's like Marcuse. He has he's adopting like rocking right-wing conspiracy theories now. He's like Marcuse is the.
Yeah. I saw that last week. Yeah.
Cultural Bolshevism.
Yeah. Nathan J. Robinson commissioned an article on Zizek that is like one of the worst. Like I would say it's almost like litigable. Like it's so horrible. It just like cites a few quotes of his out of context, declares him to be a sexist and racist, then goes through like a few citations of like dense stuff from his philosophical work, and then is just like, oh, this is all just nonsense.
Are we talking about the current affairs article?
Was that the what is Zizek for?
Right? Yeah. Current affairs. Yeah, the current affairs article.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's all. That's almost litigable. Like it's almost defamation.
I think depending on what country you're in, that's anything more strict than America, you could probably do it.
America's
in
pretty
England,
loose.
I bet you could do it.
No, I think it was pretty sad.
Yeah, well, Zizek responded to it, and he basically like he took like the first five sentences or something of his of the thing the guy wrote, and he's like, none of this resembles anything I've actually said. It's like totally out of context, and I don't even have time. Like he's like I can't go through like 5,000 words of this. Like in 5 sentences, I have to So no, it's sad though. It's sad, because like in places like Zero Book's Capital Comrades, I mean, we have our own preferences, but we're not out here like launching a fusillade attacks on like Chomskyites or something who are in the left. We're not out here doing that, right? That may not be our brand, right? But we're not doing that because it's, and let alone from a platform like Current Affairs, right? So it's like people, to me, there's 2 issues here. One would be my own belief, which I think is that, for a left-wing movement to have integrity, it always it really helps to have some organic relationship to the work of Marx, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think if you lose that, there's serious risk. But two would just be the fact that it's not the right time to do that, right? Like, why are you attacking other people on the left, right? Do we need more divisions, like in the in what's deemed the far American left, which is what, the American left that supports fucking Medicare? That's just crazy.
I just think it was pretty lazy, It reminded me a lot of the Peterson debate, that Jordan didn't even read a single book by Zizek, right, before talking with him on a globally televised debate.
Yeah, well, I think the thing is, like, people, and I don't think it's done much to diminish Zizek's reputation, and I think that
it's to capitalize on it, right?
Yeah, no, I'm saying I don't think it diminished his reputation much, the article.
Oh, no, yeah,
and I think at the end of the day, it's like, I think people, when things are that ham-fisted, I think people can tell, and I think definitely the level of, resentment, towards current affairs has went up. The level of online hostility has went up since that happened. So you see this. I mean, these people do this stuff at their own peril, right? I think someone like Ben Burgess has done a very good job of, criticizing things that he doesn't like in the left without positioning himself adversarially vis-a-vis other members of the left. Other people have not, because criticism is necessary, right? But positioning yourself adversarially, unless they've done something really beyond the pale, positioning yourself adversarially is not helpful, right? So I think Ben's walked a good line. Other people have not. And you see the results. People trust Ben, but they don't trust. Now they don't trust Matt Levy. Now they don't trust. A lot of people don't trust Nathan J. Robbins.
I think the materialist take here is that Ben has the formation of a teacher, right? So maybe he has the disposition to try to educate first and confront later.
Yeah, well, I think he just grasped the principal contradiction. Is the truth.
Precisely.
Right?
Yeah.
I think that's it. Like, and I think we all have to grasp the principal contradiction. Which, in the United States is just creating like a legitimized political space, in which left-wing ideas can be, pursued and advanced, right? That's the first step. And any, I support more radical action, certainly, but that's got to be like the ground, because we can talk about the Chinese, we talk about these groups like Bolsheviks, Chinese communists, Italian autonomia. It's like Italian autonomia came from the French Communist Party. The Bolsheviks came from the Mensheviks. The Chinese Communist Party came from the Nationalists. The first thing to do in the States is actually create a left-wing culture, right? Create a left-wing political presence, right? It doesn't have to be Chairman Mao, right? But we have to create that. We have to create that as a springboard, if nothing else, right? To create more radical kinds of activism and speech, right? So, any thoughts on that, guy? Anything?
Tim?
No? Okay.
No,
I take that as uniform agreement with the chairman here, because I am the chairman. Doug's the
there's an agreement here. I'm agreeing with you. I don't have it.
We're gonna have to have
unanimous support here.
We would have to have a rectification campaign if not. So that's good. And you don't have vested rights, Tim, because you're not in our admin board. So
I'm just here. I'm here on goodwill.
You have to, if you finish the Chinese group, you'll get advanced to the admin board. We have more and more difficult requirements for people to make the admin board.
All right, cool. I'll get a promotion. We got 8 more weeks of Deng, and then some
Just be lucky. Just be lucky. Mari had to do being an event to get on, so just consider yourself lucky.
Yeah, that was harsh.
So crunching mathematical formulas for like 3 months.
Look, it's fine. It's fine. Bring it back. I studied math. I can do it.
Okay, well, maybe we'll do Logic of Worlds eventually. But anyway, so guys, for our next, I picked out 2 essays on Deng. The next, which I think you'll enjoy. Actually, maybe 3, but one's like 1 page. So let's see. Sorry, just give me a minute. I'm just pulling this up. Okay. I really wish like this text doesn't even have like the table of contents like linked to the.
Yeah, it's all hyperlinked. I think we probably have the same. It's all hyperlinked, but doesn't click anything, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've just been adding bookmarks in my PDF.
Yeah, me
copies.
too.
Yeah, I haven't put in
Yeah.
bookmarks, so because I'm an idiot, obviously. So I'm just like, okay. So just give me a minute. I'm just gonna have to pull these out.
Yeah, don't worry.
I gotta start putting in bookmarks. Okay, there's one I'm missing here. Wait. Okay, here. So the first one, the first essay we should read is from 1948, and it's called "Carry Out the Central Committee Directive on the Work of Land Reform and Party Consolidation." Okay. You guys see that one? From June 6, 1948. Carry out the Party Central Committee Directive on the work of land reform and of party consolidation. Okay? Clear?
Okay.
And the second one will be... The second one, which I think will be interesting, the question of minority nationalities in the Southwest from 1950. That could be good, which I just, it's not like it's like the most interesting essay ever, but I just pulled it up because I think these issues get discussed a lot, so it's relevant to talks about Tibet and stuff. They get a lot of play in the West, right? And the third one would be give me a minute. Yeah, the third one would be run our school. This is like one page. Run our schools well and train cadres.
I was hoping we were going to go over that one.
Run our schools well and train cadres from 1954, which is a funny anecdote about Mao's low salary. So those will be the three we'll do, and then we'll come back next week. We'll be here on the 28th. Come back and do that, and then for the third, then I'll be assigning you the last essays from the first volume of Deng's selected works, which will demarcate about our halfway. I think, about our maybe a little less. Near. We're getting near halfway through now. So, because again, we have 7 more sessions to go through Deng, and then we'll probably have 3 or 4 sessions to go through governance of China. So this is the end of our 5th. So, thanks for coming out today, guys. Thanks for everyone who came out.
Thank you.
Good, we got it done by the 90-minute mark. That's good. And we'll be back next week. Thank you, Ernesto. Thank you, Timothy. This has been a Zero Books Capital Comrades broadcast, bringing you guys the stuff that you don't have the gumption and willpower to do on your own. And we'll be like, who reads Deng, right? We'll be here next week to do this, and I hope you guys have a great night. Join the group if you want to participate.
Please.
Yeah, take it easy, guys.